Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anil Gupta from University of Jammu. Today we are going to talk on module Corporate Governance from the paper Strategic Management. At the end of this module, you will understand the concept of corporate governance. You will know the status of corporate governance in India. You will also understand the various dimensions of corporate governance as well as understand the relationship between corporate governance and strategic management. So students, let us understand that what is the need to study corporate governance. The success or the failures of firm depend on how effectively the plans are prepared and executed. In the recent past, we have seen that the number of allegations on the top management, especially for wrongdoings, economic misbalances, and excessive executive compensation is increasing. Various CEOs and directors who are actually the employees of the owners, that is the shareholders, they are the people who actually take decisions and run the firm. But there is always this risk that the interest of the shareholders will be sacrificed for the interest of the managers. Post-liberalization in early 90s, the position and goals of the Indian corporate has changed. Over the years, numerous corporate scandals have prompted renewed interest in the mechanism and the practices of governance. So corporate governance came into limelight, which is a debatable and upcoming issues that is generating headlines both in the corporate as well as in the academic circles. Corporate governance has become the latest buzzword in the business management domain. Companies are now developing their strategies by considering the principles of corporate governance. The systems and procedures are designed strategically to structure the authority, balance the responsibility, and provide accountability to the shareholders. In a nutshell, we can say corporate governance is about balancing profitability with sustainability. So let us see that what is corporate governance. Students, corporate governance is basically a mechanism that is used to manage the relationship and conflicting interest among various stakeholders, aligning the decisions with the values and to determine and control strategic direction and performance of organization. In fact, effective corporate governance is of interest to nations as it reflects societal standards. Students, it's very much important that firms basically have effective governance mechanisms because firms which perform well due to good governance really contribute to the society and the nation building. There are various definitions of corporate governance. In fact, in 1992, a very well-known Cadbury committee at the international level defined corporate governance as the responsibilities of the board include setting the company's strategic aims, providing the leadership to put them into effect, supervising the management of the business, and reporting to the shareholders on their stewardship. The board's action are subject to laws, regulation, and the shareholders in the general meeting. Now, if you look at this definition, there are following key terms. First is setting up the company's strategic aim, which is very much important that what exactly the company really wants to do. Second point in this definition is related to leadership. And the definition defines that whatever the aim the company sets, there has to be a good leadership so that it is put into real effect. The third key term is supervising the management of the business, which means once the leadership gives the direction, the management has to supervise that the business is able to achieve its aim. And finally, the fourth aspect of this definition is reporting to the shareholders on the stewardship. This is very much important. Students, as you know, that the shareholders are the real owners of any company. And it is the responsibility of the board of the company to report back to the shareholders that what exactly the company has been doing, what it has been able to achieve, and what is the future course of action. Another definition was given by OECD principles, which defines corporate governance as
that corporate governance involves a set of relationships between the company's management, its board, its shareholders, and other stakeholders. In fact, corporate governance also provides the structure through which the objectives of company are set and the means of attaining those objectives and monitoring performance are determined. Students, if you look at this definition, it talks about the relationship between whom? Number one, company's management. Number two, its board, which is responsible to give the leadership direction. Its shareholders, that is the owners of the company, and other stakeholders. The other stakeholders basically means that the society in general is also one of the stakeholders in any company. And the role of corporate governance is to give a proper structure through which the company's objectives are achieved. Subsequently, in India also, the issue of corporate governance came into picture, specifically after the famous Harshad Mehta scam way back in early 90s. Then the SEBI constituted a committee by the name of Kumara Mangalam Committee. And when the committee submitted its report, it stated that the committee is of the view that the non-executive directors, that is those who are independent and those who are not, help bring an independent judgment to bear on board's deliberation, especially on issues of strategy, performance, management of conflicts, and standards of conduct. Students see that in this definition, the committee played a very critical role of the non-executive directors, which means directors, those who are independent and they don't have any interest whatsoever in the working of the firm. And the committee deliberately said that an independent view or an independent judgment on issues pertaining to strategy, performance, conflict, and conduct is very much important. Why this independent view? Because if there is an independent view, the directors, specifically those who are non-executive directors, can actually align the company and ensure that whatever the firm does is in the interest of all the stakeholders in large. Now, there are various principles of corporate governance which are to be kept in mind. Number one, sustainable development of all the stakeholders. Students, we all know that companies are formed to generate profits, but merely generating profit will not help the society at large in the long run. Therefore, whatever the company does, there has to be development of all the stakeholders, and this development should be of sustainable in nature. That means there has to be continuity of purpose. Number two principle is effective management and distribution of wealth. That whatever wealth the firm is able to generate, it should not be accumulated to only few people, which means that whatever wealth the company generate, it should actually percolate down to majority of people, if possible to the employees. All the shareholders should actually get the benefit of the wealth, and at last the society should also gain. Number three principle is discharge of social responsibility, which means that the firm exists in society and the firms do have the responsibility towards the society. Today we see that most of the public sector companies, it has become mandatory for them to contribute some portion of their profits in the interest of society. The number four principle is application of best management practices, which means that it's the responsibility of the board and the management to introduce best management practices. And one of the objectives behind this is that whatever the firm does should be in a position to do it efficiently and effectively. Good management practices ensures that in the long run company become much more profitable. The number five principle is compliance of law in letter and spirit. Students, we know that companies exist in society and they are governed by the law of the land. So company, wherever it operates, in whichever country it operates, It's very much important for the board and the management to understand that what laws governs that firm, and then to also ensure that whatever law exists, the company is complying to those laws in letter and spirit. And finally, the last principle is adherence to ethical spirits. Now, we know that this is a very challenging principle, but corporate governance says that companies should follow ethical standards, and whatever act it does, whatever conduct the company is doing, it should adhere to certain ethical standards. Students, let us look about the timeline of various initiatives that were taken in India with respect to corporate governance. In 1992, after the 1991 Harshad Mehta scam, government established a regulatory body by the name of Security and Exchange Board of India. So all the public sector enterprises, companies that operate in India are governed or are regulated by SEBI. In 1998, Confederation of Indian Industry, that is CII, it came up with its own voluntary code of corporate governance, which was based on the Cadbury's report. Then in 1999, SEBI established or set up a Kumara Mangalam Birla committee, and the committee recommended that the role of independent directors is very much important in the working of the firm. And this committee also talked about the role and composition of audit committees. In 2002, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Government of India, also appointed a committee by the name Naresh Chandra Committee on Corporate Audit and Governance. This committee also mentioned about the role of independent directors in the working of the committee. In the same year, in 2002, SEBI constituted another committee by the CEO of Infosys, Narayana Murthy. Students, as we know that Infosys played a very critical role in setting up the ethical standards at the global level in terms of working. On the basis of this report of this committee, Clause 49 was revised, and present Clause 49 is applicable to all the companies which have paid up capital of 5 crores or more, or the companies which have net worth of 25 crores or more any time in the history of the company. Recently, way back in 2014, after the coming up of Companies Act 2013, SEBI again approved certain amendments in the listing agreement with an objective to improve transparency and also to empower minority stakeholders in their decision making. One of the recent addition in 2014 was the role of women as part of the independent directors, as part of the board. SEBI made it mandatory to have few women members as part of the board. So as I was discussing, let us look at what are the recent reforms in corporate governance. Number one pertains to appointment of women directors. It has been made mandatory to have at least one women director as part of the board. The second reform pertains to restricting the number of independent directorship. This issue is that one person can serve how many boards? So there has been a cap which has been posed in the recent reforms where an individual can serve only a maximum of 7 boards as an independent director. And in case if the person is working as a full-time director, he cannot serve more than 3 boards. This is a very important reform which has been introduced. The third pertains to what should be the maximum tenure of an independent director. So as per the new guidelines, a person cannot serve for more than 10 years. That is, he can have a maximum of 2 5-year terms as an independent director. Point number 4 pertains to what is the role of audit committee. And the recent reforms that has been incorporated is that whatever audit committee a company constitutes, 2/3 of its members should be independent directors. Number 5 is improve disclosure norms. As we have been discussing, that reporting of the working of the company is an important dimension of corporate governance. So SABI has included various measures that improves that what all is to be disclosed at a regular interval. And finally, e-voting has been made mandatory for all the listed companies in India. So students, let us look at what are the various objectives of corporate governance. There are various objectives set forth, and we are listing some very key important objectives. At number 1, it is that the board should subserve the concerns of stakeholders, which means that board should be aware of that what are the concerns, and ultimately it has to serve the concerns of the stakeholders. There should be a properly structured board to take independent and objective decisions. The word independent is the key here, and we have seen that there is too much emphasis on having independent decisions by non-executive directors. The board is balanced to take care of the interest of all the stakeholders. So which means what is the composition of the board is equally important. They should have enough competence that they are able to take the interest of stakeholders into consideration. There should be transparent procedures and practices which are adopted for taking decisions, which means whatever decisions the board takes, it should be based on the strength of adequate information, which means it's the role of the management to provide continuous information to the board so that they're able to take right decisions which are in the interest of the shareholders and the stakeholders. The next point pertains to keeping the stakeholders informed of material developments in the company. Reporting practices, disclosure norms are an essential dimension of any good corporate governance practices. The board gets the mechanism for effective and regular monitoring of the management. Students, as I was telling, that the role of management information system is very important for effective governance of any firm. So therefore, the company should establish a good MIS system that provides continuous information to the board. Last but not the least, that the board remains in effective control of the affairs. That is, the objective of the board should be to take the organization forward, maximize long-term values and shareholders' wealth. Companies exist so that they are able to grow in the long run. And it is the responsibility of the board to have a clear-cut vision about the future of the firm. The governance mechanism should ensure that everybody gains in the long run. When I use this word everybody, it not only means that the shareholders get the benefit, but all the stakeholders should ultimately get benefit out of the working of the company.
Now let us understand what are the elements of good corporate governance. The board should be transparent in policies, processes, and should be independent. We have discussed this earlier also, that the independence of board is very much important just to ensure that the decision making is fair and independent. The board should be effective and should be committed to achieve sustained prosperity of all. There should be accountability to the stakeholders, which should ensure that the proper communication channel is established. Whatever actions are taken at the corporate level, they should be communicated to the shareholders in a timely manner. Similarly, fairness to all stakeholders should be at the priority. The fairness is one of the important elements of a good corporate governance. The organization should be socially and environmentally responsible and should also be concerned for the regulations. So whatever law are there in the land, they should be complied in letter and spirit. Further, we all know that organizations are part of the society, so their responsibility towards the society should be of prime importance. Clear and unambiguous legislation and regulations are foundation to effective corporate governance. So any country that has very clear-cut legislations ensures that the corporate governance is properly in place. Clear objectives, appropriate ethical framework, clear demarcation of responsibility and accountability, and establishing clear boundaries for acceptable behavior is an important element of corporate governance. The ethical practices and their codes should be explicitly prescribed, and whatever conduct is desired should be communicated and clearly understood and followed by each member of the organization. So, the long term corporate strategy should also document the objectives of the company along with the achievable and measurable performance targets and milestones. The audit committee should coordinate with the management, internally, and statutory auditors. We all know that audit committee is one of the important aspects of a good corporate governance mechanism. The audit committee should review the adequacy of internal control and compliance with significant policies. Again, as we discussed earlier, in the recent reforms, the independence of audit committee is equally important. Risk, being an important part of any corporate governance, should be clearly identified and analyzed by taking measures. A proper mechanism should be developed and reviewed at regular intervals. A vigil mechanism and the whistleblower policy should be formulated that helps the employee in reporting about unethical behaviors, any actual or suspected frauds, or violation of company's code of conduct.
Students, we have recently discussed about the elements of good corporate governance. There are key issues which we should know to understand the concept of corporate governance better. The first pertains that there has to be a separation of ownership and control. Any company is made up of two organs. One, it is the board of directors, and second is the shareholders. The primary legal mechanism that is designed to align CEO's action with that of shareholders' interest is a company's board of directors, which means whatever the company board of directors, the basic task is to ensure that whatever is the shareholders' interest, the CEO is actually taking action that is in alignment with the interest of the shareholders. The board is elected by shareholders. They are responsible to ensure that CEO behaves in a way that promotes shareholders' interest, which means that the chief executive officer of the company should only take actions that are in the large interest of the shareholders. So students, there is an agency relationship. So whatever is the relationship between the owners of the company and the managers, those who are managing the task of the company, there is always an agency relationship between them. The owners are basically the principals, and the decision makers, that is the management, they are basically the agents. And these decision makers, including the chief executive officer, they're hired to manage principals' operations and maximize return on investment. Students, understand that why do shareholders invest money in any business? Their basic objective of investing money in any business is to maximize their returns. And it is the job of the management, including the CEO, to ensure that the operations undertaken by the company help to maximize the returns on the investment of the shareholders. So which means there is a separation of ownership and managerial control. But there it can be problematic. Why it can be problematic? Because the principals at times could have different objectives, and the agents who are actually running the business or who are actually running the operations of the business could have different objectives. So whenever there is a clash of objectives, there is a possibility of misconduct, which the board has to ensure does not happen in the long run. So it is difficult for principals to know beforehand which agent will act opportunistically. There is quite a possibility that the agent or the managers and the chief executive could ultimately do certain acts which can turn out to be opportunistic. So therefore, the governance and control mechanism that are put into place just prevents the agents from acting opportunistically. So this is the role of the board of any company just to supersede and just to supervise that nothing of this type really gets into picture. The famous scam of Ranbaxy way back in 2004 is a perfect case of systematic fraud, as the company was exposed to risk by manipulating the data that was submitted to the regulators. So students agents can do such kind of task, but it's the responsibility of the board to see that such things do not happen. The corporate governance failures manifested in the board's failure to detect fraud, absence of adequate risk management, and unethical culture. So let us understand that what is the relationship between agency cost and governance mechanism. Since agency cost is basically the sum of incentives, monitoring, enforcement, and individual financial losses incurred by the principal, because the governance mechanism cannot guarantee total compliance by the agent. So if the governance mechanism is poor and it does not ensure total compliance, there can be various costs in terms of the losses or monitoring enforcement that really turn up. So in general, the managerial interest may prevail when the governance mechanism is weak, as is exemplified by allowing the managers a significant amount of autonomy to make strategic decisions. On the other hand, if strong governance mechanisms are used, the firm's strategy should better reflect the interest of the shareholders. So let us talk another issue which pertains to ownership concentration. Now, students, at times it's important to see that who really owns a business, how many shareholders really control majority of shares of the company. So in case there are large block shareholders, and the percentage of share basically defines ownership concentration. And if few shareholders really own majority of the shares of the company, that is not a good indication, because ownership concentration as a governance mechanism has received considerable interest because large shareholders demanding to adopt effective governance mechanism to control managerial decisions. This can be good as well as bad. Why? If the concentration, ownership concentration is high, and if their interests are not in the interest of the large society at large, it can result in poor governance. And this is one of the biggest challenge and issue of corporate governance in India. Why? Because the ownership basically lies in the hands of few founding family members, which means in real sense, even though it's a public listed company, majority of companies reflect that there are shareholders which really govern the company. There is an independent board which is also reflected. There is a management which takes care of the action of the company, but still, if the majority of shares are in control of few family members, the real working of the company will never be independent. So this issue of ownership concentration is an important dimension of corporate governance which needs to be looked into in any specific country. Similarly, from ownership concentration, the issue of executive compensation has also received attention by the various policy makers. Executive compensation is a governance mechanism that seeks to align the interest of the managers and owners through salaries, bonuses, and long-term incentive compensation such as stock, awards, and options. The use of longer-term pays helps the firms to cope with or avoid potential agency problems by linking managerial wealth to the wealth of the shareholders. So as we discussed earlier, that one of the objective of any corporate governance is to ensure equal distribution of wealth. So the major concern is that how much compensation is actually going to the manager's CEO, which becomes part of the executive compensation, and how much wealth are these managers able to generate without actually compromising the long-term wealth of the shareholders. Students, it's important to understand that executive compensation directly affects the profitability of any company. And we know that ultimately the shareholders basically divide the profit among themselves. So if the executive compensation is exorbitant, which is not in line with the real working of the company, it ultimately or negatively affects the overall wealth of the shareholders. However, if the company is growing well and the management is able to ensure the long term wealth creation of the company, in those cases, even if the managers and agency people are paid higher, it really does not affect the overall wealth of the shareholders in the long run. That is, the valuation of the firm should increase because of the good working of the agency people, that is, the management people. So, let us look into the last issue, which is market for corporate control. Students, it is the external governance mechanism that becomes active when a firm's internal control fails. And I know this is not a very good sign because the internal control mechanisms should be strong enough so that the external governance mechanism do not come into play. So the market for corporate control is made of individuals and firms that buy ownership position in or take over potentially undervalued corporations. So whenever the internal control mechanisms fail, there is quite a possibility that the firm really becomes a potential target for takeover by various stakeholders in the market. So, a good quality board will always ensure that the internal control mechanisms do not fail. That is, the management which is given the duty and responsibility to create value for the shareholders work in the interest of the shareholders in the large.
Now let us try to relate the relationship between corporate governance and strategic management. Students, we know that the relationship between organizations, environment, economy, and society and economy is changing very fast. The number of financial scandals around the world have compelled to develop strategic management by adopting terms and styles which match with the reality. The top management must take care of the interest of all the stakeholders. And from this objective, the financial society becomes really strict. Corporate governance was taken as a solution and key to earn back the lost trust. And here, the role of strategic management plays a very critical role as it enhances the accountability and social responsibility as part of the strategy, where shareholders' interests are of prime importance. Corporate governance is about aligning the interest of the top level managers with the interest of the shareholders. Corporate governance is related to the way how the company is controlled and administered. It is an important part of strategic management that can really help to improve the performance of the company. Ultimately, value creation and competitive advantage are the common objectives on a long term basis for both corporate governance and the process of strategic management. So, students, let us now summarize what we have learned in this model. We read that there is a dynamic relationship between corporate governance and strategic management. The top management is responsible for planning and execution of the strategies which are in the best interest of the shareholders. There are many reasons why corporate governance is must for the organization, and one of the major reasons is to regain the lost trust of the market. Both internal and external mechanisms are required for effective governance and decision making to be built in. Thank you very much.